The morning mist in the Tennessee Valley does not just sit on the land. It clings to it like a damp wool blanket, heavy with the scent of pine needles and the iron-rich tang of the red clay soil. Marcus Henderson stood at the base of the steepest ridge on his property, a 60-degree incline that most men in the county considered useless for anything other than timber or erosion. He held a transit level in one hand and a bundle of sharpened cedar stakes in the other. Across the fence line, where the land flattened out into the easy, predictable pastures of the Miller farm, Silas Miller sat atop his idling tractor, watching Marcus with a look that was somewhere between pity and genuine confusion. Silas shifted his cap, wiped the sweat from his brow, and shouted over the rattle of the diesel engine. He asked if Marcus was planning to breed a new species of mountain goat, or if he had simply forgotten that pigs were born with 4 legs of equal length. The laughter that followed was dry and raspy, the sound of a man who believed the earth was something to be conquered by force rather than understood by its contours. Silas told him that a pig pen belonged on the flat, where a man could get a tractor and to scrape the muck, and where the animals would not spend half their lives sliding toward the creek. He told him that the waste would pool at the bottom and create a swamp of filth that would rot the hooves off every hog he owned. The community at the Grange Hall echoed these sentiments. They spoke of tradition, of the way things had been done since the pioneers first cleared the brush. A hog lot was a place of labor, they said. It was a place where a man proved his worth through the strength of his back and the frequency with which he shoveled the heavy, wet slurry of manure into a spreader. To build on a slope was to invite disaster, and to build the way Marcus was planning was seen as a lazy man's errand that would end in expensive, smelling failure. Marcus did not argue. He had learned long ago that words rarely change the minds of men who measure their wisdom by the number of calluses on their palms. He looked at the ridge not as an obstacle, but as a giant, sleeping engine. He saw the potential energy stored in the height of the land. He understood that gravity was a worker that never slept, never asked for a wage, and never complained about the heat. Marcus could have built a standard concrete slab in the valley. He could have spent his mornings knee-deep in the muck, fighting the inevitable accumulation of waste. He could have accepted the heavy odor of ammonia as the natural perfume of a successful farm, but he did not. Instead, he drove the first stake into the side of the hill, precisely 12 feet above the valley floor, marking the spot where his innovation would begin. His motivation was not born of laziness, but of a memory that haunted him every time the weather turned cold. He remembered his father, a man of immense strength who had been broken by the very land he loved. He remembered the winter of 1964, when the elder Henderson had slipped in the icy muck of a traditional pig pen, his spine popping like a dry twig under the weight of a full-grain sack. Marcus had watched his father spend the rest of his years staring out the window at the fields he could no longer work, his body a map of unnecessary aches. Marcus had decided then that he would not be a slave to the shovel. He spent years studying the way water moved through the ravines, the way the forest floor digested the fallen leaves, and the way the temperature changed as one climbed the ridge. He spent months in his workshop, sketching diagrams on pieces of scrap plywood. He studied the principles of anaerobic digestion and the carbon-to-nitrogen ratios required to turn raw waste into stable compost. He calculated the specific gravity of porcine manure and the friction coefficients of various surfaces. He knew that if he could get the angle of the floors exactly right, the natural movement of the pigs themselves would act as a conveyor belt. He wasn't just building a chiquero, as the old-timers might call it in their ancestral tongues. He was building a biological refinery. The preparation was exhaustive. Marcus didn't just buy lumber, he salvaged white oak from an old collapsed barn, knowing that the high tanning content would resist the acidic nature of the hog waste better than any modern pressure-treated pine. He collected hundreds of feet of 4-inch PVC piping and scouted the local quarries for a specific grade of crushed basalt. Every evening, the neighbors would see the lights of his truck as he hauled materials up the narrow trail. They whisper that Marcus was building a monument to his own ego, a staircase to nowhere that would eventually slide down the hill and bury him in the very earth he was trying to outsmart. The skepticism was not just verbal, it was a weight that Marcus carried. In a small town, an unconventional idea is often treated as a personal insult to those who do the work the hard way. When he went to the hardware store for bags of high-strength concrete, the clerk asked if he was building a bunker or a pig pen. When he explained the multi-tiered drainage system, the men standing around the coffee pot just shook their heads. They told him that pigs were messy, and no amount of fancy engineering would change the nature of a beast that liked to wallow. Marcus would just nod, pay for his supplies, and head back to the ridge. The construction began in earnest in the early spring, when the ground was soft enough to work, but before the humidity of the Tennessee summer became unbearable. The first phase involved the excavation of 3 distinct levels, or terraces, cut directly into the hillside. This was the most grueling part of the process. Without the room to maneuver a large backhoe, Marcus had to do much of the work with a small garden tractor and a hand shovel. He was carving a 3-story structure into the earth, with each level serving a specific biological and mechanical purpose. The top level was the living quarters. It was a sheltered area with a floor made of heavy white oak slats, spaced exactly 1 inch apart. Marcus had researched the average hoof size of a finishing hog and determined that this gap was the perfect compromise between animal safety and waste passage. He calculated the slope of this floor to be exactly 5 degrees, not enough to make the pigs uncomfortable, but just enough so that as they walked and shifted, their weight would naturally press the manure through the slats. Below the slats was the second level, the separation chamber. This was where the real innovation lay. Most farmers treated manure as a singular, messy problem. Marcus viewed it as 2 distinct resources, a liquid nitrogen-rich fertilizer and a solid carbon-rich soil builder. The second level featured a sloped concrete floor covered with a layer of smooth, non-porous epoxy. As the waste fell through the slats from the level above, the liquid fraction would immediately begin to run down the epoxy slope, directed into a series of 4-inch pipes. The solids, however, would remain on the surface. This is where Marcus applied his understanding of physics. He installed a series of low-pressure misting nozzles along the top of the separation chamber, triggered by a simple mechanical timer. Twice a day, a brief burst of water would lubricate the epoxy surface. Because the floor was set at a 15-degree angle, the solids would slowly migrate downward, helped along by the vibration of the pigs moving on the floor above. It was a slow-motion avalanche of nutrients, moving precisely where Marcus wanted it to go. The third and final level was the composting vault. This was a massive, reinforced concrete basin built at the very base of the ridge. It was designed to be easily accessible from the valley floor by a tractor with a front-end loader, but it was separated from the living quarters by 12 feet of vertical drop. This vault was where the magic of biology took over. Marcus filled the bottom of the vault with 3 feet of dry hardwood sawdust and shredded corn stalks carbon sources that would balance the high nitrogen content of the incoming pig waste. As the construction progressed, the setbacks were frequent and discouraging. During the 3rd week of the build, a sudden thunderstorm dumped for inches of rain in 3 hours. Because the terraces were not yet reinforced, the middle level collapsed, burying Marcus's carefully laid PVC pipes under a ton of wet clay. He spent 3 days digging it out by hand, his boots suctioned into the mud, the mocking words of Silas Miller ringing in his ears. Silas had stopped by to watch the cleanup, leaning against his fence with a toothpick in his mouth, remarking that the mountains seemed to be winning. Marcus didn't answer. He simply refined his design, adding heavy-duty retaining walls made of dry-stacked stone and reinforced with steel rebar. He learned that he couldn't just fight the hill. He had to anchor his dream into the very bedrock. He adjusted the angle of the drainage pipes, increasing the fall to ensure that even the thickest slurry wouldn't clog the system during a cold snap. He spent nights by the light of a kerosene lantern, polishing the epoxy on the separation floor until it was as smooth as a mirror. By the middle of the summer, the structure was a sight to behold. It looked less like a farm building and more like a modernistic hillside villa. The white oak of the upper level had weathered to a soft silver gray, and the concrete of the lower vault was hidden behind a screen of planted sunflowers and elderberry bushes. The neighbors began to call it Henderson's Folly. They joked that the pigs would need oxygen masks to live that high up, and that the smell would be carried by the wind for 20 miles because it was so elevated. But Marcus was ready for the animals. He brought in 20 Duroc Berkshire crosses, hardy pigs with strong legs and a natural curiosity. When he first released them onto the sloped white oak floor, they were hesitant. They sniffed the slats and looked down into the darkness of the separation chamber. But within an hour, they were nesting in the clean straw Marcus had provided in the sheltered corner. They began to move about, their heavy bodies pressing against the floor, and Marcus watched with bated breath as the first traces of waste disappeared through the slats exactly as he had planned. He monitored the temperatures in the composting vault daily. Using a long-stemmed compost thermometer, he watched the dial climb. In the first week, it hit 100 degrees Fahrenheit. By the second week, as the bacterial activity intensified, the core of the pile reached a staggering 145 degrees. This was the critical threshold. At this temperature, pathogens are destroyed, weed seeds are neutralized, and the raw waste begins its transformation into what Marcus called black gold. The most remarkable thing, however, was the lack of smell. Because the liquids were immediately separated and piped into a subterranean holding tank, there was no standing pool of anaerobic filth. The solids were being kept aerobic by the layer of sawdust and the natural airflow created by the hillside's thermal currents. A man could stand 5 feet away from the Henderson pig pen and smell nothing but the faint, earthy scent of a forest floor after a rain. The skeptics, of course, were not convinced by the lack of odor. They argue that the system was too complex, that the epoxy would wear out, that the pipes would freeze in the winter, or that the pigs would eventually develop joint problems from the slight incline. They could not accept that a problem they had struggled with for generations could be solved with a bit of geometry and a deep understanding of gravity. They waited for the system to fail. They waited for the winter, or the spring floods, or the inevitable breakdown of the mechanical timers. They waited for Marcus to admit that he had wasted his time and money on a dream that defied the common sense of the valley. Marcus ignored the waiting. He spent his time fine-tuning the carbon-to-nitrogen ratio, experimenting with different bedding materials in the vault. He found that a mixture of oak leaves and pine shavings produced a compost with a texture so fine it felt like silk between his fingers. He began to apply the finished product to a small kitchen garden near his house. The results were immediate and almost frightening. Tomato plants that usually grew to 4 feet tall were hitting 6 feet by mid-July, their stalks as thick as a man's wrist and laden with deep red, heavy fruit. The corn he planted with a side dressing of the premium adubo was a dark, vibrant green, standing to feet taller than Silas Miller's corn across the road. Despite the visual evidence of the garden, the community remained aloof. They saw the garden as a fluke, a result of a wet spring, or perhaps a particularly good patch of soil Marcus had hidden away. They didn't want to believe that the waste they spent hundreds of hours a year hauling and spreading was actually a resource they were mismanaging. To them, manure was a burden. To Marcus, it was a currency. He began to document the labor savings. On a traditional farm with 20 hogs, a man would spend at least 30 minutes a day scraping pens and another for hours a week hauling waste. That totaled over 200 hours of back-breaking labor a year. Marcus, on the other hand, spent less than 5 minutes a week checking the pipes and another 10 minutes adding fresh sawdust to the vault. The gravity did the scraping. The bacteria did the processing. The hill did the hauling. He had effectively reclaimed 5 weeks of his life every year, time he could now spend on improving other parts of his homestead or simply sitting on his porch, watching the sun set over the ridge. The architecture of the pen was a lesson in permanence. Marcus had used 5,000 psi concrete for the vault, reinforced with a grid of half-inch rebar. He had designed the walls with a slight batter, or inward lean, to resist the lateral pressure of the hillside. He had installed a bypass system for the drainage pipes, allowing him to divert the liquid fertilizer to different parts of his lower pasture depending on the season. It was a masterpiece of rural engineering, a fusion of old-world materials and new-world physics. But the real test was yet to come. Every innovation faces a moment of crisis, a point where the theoretical beauty of the design meets the raw, unyielding power of nature. In the Tennessee Valley, that crisis usually comes in the form of the 100-year storms, the massive weather systems that roll off the Gulf of Mexico and get trapped against the Appalachian Mountains, dumping weeks' worth of rain in a matter of hours. As the autumn of the first year approached, the sky began to take on a bruised, purple hue that the old-timers knew all too well. The barometer dropped with a sickening speed, and the wind began to howl through the gaps and the ridges. The community began to batten down the hatches, moving equipment to high ground and reinforcing the traditional flatland pens that they knew would soon become lakes of mud. Silas Miller stopped his tractor by Marcus's gate one last time, warning him that the hill was going to turn into a slide and that his fancy pig pen would be the first thing to go. Marcus just looked at the ridge, checked the anchors on his white oak roof, and waited. He had built for the storm. He had calculated the flow rates, he had trusted the gravity. Now, he would see if the gravity would stay loyal. The final phase of the construction was not about the structure itself, but about the ecosystem that surrounded it. Marcus knew that a machine, no matter how well engineered, is only as good as its integration with the environment. He spent the remaining days of the dry season installing a secondary filtration belt at the base of the composting vault. This wasn't just a simple drain, it was a bioswale, a 30-foot-long trench filled with layers of charcoal, pea gravel, and a specific variety of marsh grass known for its ability to absorb heavy metals and excess phosphates. He calculated that even if the liquid holding tanks reached their 85% capacity during a heavy saturation event, the overflow would be scrubbed clean before it ever reached the creek at the bottom of the valley. He measured the porosity of the soil, ensuring that the percolation rate would handle at least 3 inches of runoff per hour. He could have relied on a standard septic field. He could have just let the excess run into the woods, assuming the forest would handle the load, but he didn't. He wanted a closed-loop system where every drop of water and every ounce of organic matter was accounted for and redirected toward productivity. The neighbors watched him planting grasses and hauling bags of charcoal, their laughter now tinged with a weary sort of confusion. Silas Miller called out from his fence line, asking if Marcus was planning to bottle the pig water and sell it as a health tonic. The man at the general store joked that Marcus was the only man in Tennessee who treated a hog pen like a laboratory at Vanderbilt University. They didn't understand that precision was the only antidote to the unpredictability of nature. The storm did not arrive with a sudden clap of thunder. It began as a low, oppressive change in the atmosphere, a heavy stillness that made the livestock restless and the birds fall silent. The sky turned a shade of bruised plum, and the wind began to pull the heat out of the valley, replacing it with a damp, metallic chill. Marcus stood on the top level of his hillside chiquero, feeling the vibration of the coming weather in his own bones. He checked the tension on the heavy-duty anchor bolts that held the white oak frame to the bedrock. He checked the seals on the PVC junctions. He watched his 20 hogs, who had instinctively moved to the most sheltered corner of the upper terrace, huddling together for warmth. When the rain finally started, it didn't fall in drops. It fell in sheets, a relentless gray wall of water that blurred the distinction between the earth and the sky. Within the first hour, the valley floor was a saturated sponge. In the second hour, the small creek that marked the boundary of the Henderson and Miller properties began to crest its banks, its usually clear water turning into a churning, coffee-colored torrent of mud and debris. The rain gauge on Marcus's porch registered 2 inches in 90 minutes. This was the kind of event that usually meant catastrophe for the local farmers. On the flat land of the Miller farm, the situation turned dire with terrifying speed. Because Silas's pig pens were built on level ground with standard concrete floors, there was nowhere for the water to go. The traditional drainage gutters, designed for a standard afternoon shower, were immediately overwhelmed. Within 3 hours, the hogs on the Miller farm were standing belly deep in a rising tide of cold rainwater mixed with days of accumulated manure. The ammonia, usually dissipated by the wind, was trapped by the heavy moisture, creating a stinging, toxic fog that made the animals panic. Silas and his sons were out in the deluge, their yellow slickers gleaming under the lightning, desperately trying to shovel muck out of the pens as the water rushed in. It was a losing battle. For every shovel of waste they moved, the rain washed to more back into the stalls. They were fighting a war against gravity on a battlefield that was perfectly level, and they were losing. Up on the ridge, Marcus Henderson watched the storm through a different lens. As the rain hammered the roof of his structure, the gravity-fed system began to perform its intended symphony. The upper terrace remained perfectly drained. The 5-degree slope of the white oak floor meant that water could not pool. It flowed across the wood, through the 1-inch gaps, and onto the separation level below. Because Marcus had polished the epoxy surface to a mirror finish, the increased volume of water actually improved the system's efficiency. The rainwater acted as a high-pressure rinse, scouring the separation floor and carrying every trace of solid waste down toward the composting vault at a velocity that prevented any buildup. In the separation chamber, the liquid-solid separator was working at peak capacity. The pipes, oversized by Marcus's deliberate design, hummed with the sound of rushing water. The liquid fraction was being diverted into the subterranean tanks while the solids were being flushed into the vault. In the vault, the 3 feet of dry sawdust and corn stalks acted like a massive organic sponge. Even as hundreds of gallons of water and waste poured in, the carbon-rich bed absorbed the moisture, maintaining its aerobic integrity. The thermometer, which Marcus checked by the light of a waterproof flashlight, showed that the core temperature of the compost pile was actually rising. The influx of fresh material and the thermal insulation provided by the reinforced concrete walls allowed the thermophilic bacteria to go into a frenzy of activity. The crisis intensified during the middle of the night. A massive oak tree on the ridge above Marcus's property, its roots loosened by the saturation, came crashing down. It fell just yards away from the chiquero, the impact shaking the ground like an earthquake. Marcus felt the tremor and ran out into the storm, fearing the worst, but the structure held. The retaining walls, built with the batter of an ancient fortress and anchored into the limestone bedrock, didn't move an inch. The water that would have normally caused a mudslide was being managed by Marcus's terrace system, which acted as a series of catch basins, breaking the momentum of the runoff and directing it safely away from the slope. By the morning of the second day, the valley was a scene of agricultural devastation. The Miller farm was a lake of brown water. Silas had lost 3 piglets to the cold and the rising water, and his main breeding sow was suffering from foot rot after hours of standing in the saturated muck. The smell was unbearable, a heavy, cloying scent of rot that hung in the still, wet air. The traditional pens were ruined, their fences leaning at precarious angles and their floors covered in a foot of stinking silt. Silas and his men were exhausted, their faces etched with the fatigue of a night spent in a futile struggle against the inevitable. Marcus Henderson walked down to the fence line. He was dry, having spent the night in his house once he realized the system was handling the load. He looked at Silas, who was leaning against his tractor, his head in his hands. Marcus didn't offer a word of judgment. He didn't point out that he had warned them. He didn't mention the mountain goats or the lazy man's errand. Instead, he reached over the fence and offered Silas a thermos of hot coffee. Silas looked up, his eyes bloodshot, and then looked past Marcus at the ridge. From the valley floor, the Henderson chiquero looked like a beacon of order in a world of chaos. The pigs were visible on the upper level, dry and calm, rooting through a fresh layer of straw Marcus had tossed down. There was no standing water, no visible waste, and most importantly, no smell of decay. The water flowing out of the bottom of Marcus's bioswale and into the creek was clear as the rain that had fallen from the sky. The innovation hadn't just survived the storm, it had used the storm to clean itself. The validation was not a single moment, but a series of realizations that rippled through the community in the days following the deluge. It began when the local vet, Dr. Aristhone, came to check on the livestock in the valley. He visited the Miller farm first, documenting the respiratory infections and the hoof issues caused by the standing water. When he climbed the ridge to Marcus's place, he was stunned. He found 20 of the healthiest hogs he had seen in his 30 years of practice. He noted the lack of parasites, the clean skin of the animals, and the absence of the typical stress markers found in confined swine. He asked Marcus how he managed the waste during the peak of the rain. Marcus simply walked him down to the composting vault. When Marcus opened the access hatch to the vault, the doctor stepped back, expecting a foul odor. Instead, he was met with a waft of warm, earthy air that smelled like deep forest mulch. Marcus took a shovel and turned over the top layer of the pile. Steam rose into the cool morning air. The raw manure from the past 48 hours had already been mostly broken down, integrated into the carbon bed by the intense heat of the bacterial colony. It wasn't waste anymore. It was a rich, dark, friable substance that looked like the most expensive potting soil a man could buy at a premium nursery. Word spread quickly. The same man who had laughed at the staircase to know where began to show up at the base of the ridge, ostensibly to check on the fence line or to see if Marcus needed any help with the fallen oak. But their eyes were always on the structure. They watched as Marcus hitched his tractor to the front-end loader and backed it into the composting vault. With no manual shoveling, no scraping, and no wading through muck, Marcus loaded 3 tons of stabilized, high-grade organic fertilizer into his spreader. In 20 minutes, he had done what would have taken Silas Miller 3 days of back-breaking labor to accomplish. The results in the fields were the final, undeniable proof. Marcus began to spread the premium adubo on his lower pastures, which had been leached of nutrients by the heavy rains. Within 2 weeks, the grass there was a deeper shade of emerald than any other field in the county. It grew thick and lush, attracting the local deer and improving the grazing for Marcus's small herd of cattle. He took a sample of the compost to the University Extension Office for testing. The results came back a week later. The nutrient profile was off the charts. The nitrogen was stable, the phosphorus was perfectly balanced, and the microbial count was higher than most commercial organic fertilizers. The report called it class a biosolid fertilizer, but Marcus just called it what it was, the result of letting the earth do the work. One by one, the skeptics began to cross the creek. The first was young Caleb, Silas Miller's youngest son, who was tired of the endless cycle of shoveling and the smell that seemed to have permeated his very skin. He asked Marcus if he could see the diagrams Marcus had drawn on the plywood. He wanted to know about the angles of the floor and the specific type of epoxy Marcus had used. He wanted to know how to build a retaining wall that could hold back a mountain. Marcus didn't hide his knowledge. He could have patented the design. He could have charged his neighbors for the blueprints. He could have kept the secret of the black gold to himself, but he didn't. He invited Caleb into his workshop and handed him a pencil. Marcus explained the philosophy of the slope. He told Caleb that the secret wasn't in the concrete or the wood, but in the humility to realize that we are part of a system, not the masters of it. He explained that when you fight gravity, you lose, but when you dance with it, you find a partner that can carry the heaviest loads. He showed him the calculations for the separation chamber, explaining how the surface tension of water and the friction of the epoxy worked together to sort the nutrients. He spoke about the bacteria in the vault as if they were his most valued employees, describing their needs for oxygen, moisture, and carbon. The realization began to sink in across the valley. The farmers saw that Marcus wasn't just working less. He was producing more. He was turning a liability manure into an asset. He was turning a geographic disadvantage, the steep ridge, into a mechanical advantage. He had reclaimed his time, his health, and his land. The laughter that had once echoed in the Grange Hall was replaced by a quiet, thoughtful respect. They could have continued the old way. They could have kept their flatland traditions and their aching backs. But as they looked at the lush, green fields of the Henderson farm and the clear water of the creek, they realized that the old way was no longer the only way. The winter that followed the Great Storm was one of the harshest the Tennessee Valley had seen in a generation. The temperatures plummeted to 15 degrees below zero, and the ground froze to a depth of 18 inches. In any other year, this would have been a season of misery for the local pig farmers. Usually, the waste in the traditional flat pens would freeze into solid, jagged blocks of ice and filth, making it impossible to clean until the spring thaw. The animals would suffer from belly chills, and the farmers would spend their mornings with pickaxes, trying to chip away at the frozen mess just to keep the feeders clear. But on the ridge, Marcus Henderson's innovation proved that a well-designed system does not fear the cold, it uses the cold to prove its resilience. Marcus had designed the liquid drainage pipes to be buried 3 feet deep, well below the frost line, and the sections that were exposed to the air were wrapped in 2 inches of closed-cell foam insulation protected by a secondary layer of PVC. He had calculated the thermal mass of the composting vault with the precision of a physicist. Even when the outside air was bitter enough to crack a stone, the core of the compost pile remained a steady, pulsing 130 degrees. The bacterial activity was so intense that it created a natural floor heating effect for the pigs above. While Silas Miller's hogs were shivering on frozen concrete, Marcus's hogs were lounging on white oak slats that were warm to the touch, their breath rising in small, contented puffs of steam. It was during this frozen January that the tide of public opinion finally turned for good. Silas Miller, a man whose pride was as thick as the clay he farmed, walked up the Henderson driveway one morning when the wind was howling out of the north. He didn't come to mock, and he didn't come to offer advice. He came because he had lost 2 more sows to the cold, and his back was so seized up from hacking at frozen manure that he could hardly stand straight. He stood at the edge of the composting vault, watching the steam rise, and he asked Marcus if the offer to share the blueprints still stood. He didn't just want a new pig pen, he wanted a new way of living. He wanted to know how to stop fighting the world and start working with it. Marcus didn't just give him the plans, he gave him his time. Throughout that winter, the 2 men sat in Marcus's workshop, surrounded by the smell of cedar shavings and the low hum of a wood stove. They looked at the topography of the Miller farm, finding a secondary ridge that Silas had always ignored because it was too rocky to plow. Marcus showed him how to use that rock as a foundation. They calculated the necessary slope for Silas's larger herd, adjusting the terrace widths to 24 feet and increasing the liquid storage capacity by 40%. This was the beginning of the legacy the moment an individual innovation became a communal transformation. By the time the redbuds began to bloom in the spring, the Henderson standard was being adopted across 3 counties. It wasn't just about pigs anymore. Marcus helped a neighbor adapt the sloped floor, gravity separation model for a poultry house. By setting the slats at a steeper 30-degree angle and using a fine mesh screen, they were able to separate the high-nitrogen chicken litter from the feathers and dust instantly. Another farmer applied the principle to a goat dairy, finding that the natural climbing instinct of the goats made them perfect candidates for a multi-level, hillside milking parlor. The technical evolution of the system continued as the community experimented. They found that by adding a secondary layer of biochar to the separation floor, they could capture even more of the ammonia, locking it into a stable form that was even more potent as a fertilizer. They experimented with different carbon sources in the vault, discovering that shredded cardboard and old newspapers worked just as well as sawdust, providing a way for the local town to recycle its paper waste directly into the soil. The premium adubo was no longer a secret, it was the gold standard of the region. The environmental impact was measurable and profound. The local watershed committee conducted a study of the creek that ran through the valley. For decades, the water had been high in nitrates and E. coli, a direct result of runoff from the traditional flatland farms. 2 years after Marcus built his hillside chiquero, the nitrate levels had dropped by 65%. The water was clearer than it had been since the 1940s. A species of native brook trout, which hadn't been seen in the valley for 30 years, began to reappear in the deep pools near the Miller-Henderson line. The innovation hadn't just saved the farmers' backs, it had saved the river's soul. Marcus's philosophy on sharing this knowledge was rooted in a deep understanding of the American rural tradition. He believed that a man's wealth was not measured by what he kept behind a fence, but by the strength of the community he helped build. He often said that a single green farm in a valley of brown ones is just a target, but a valley of green farms is a fortress. He refused to take royalties for his designs, insisting that any farmer who built a Henderson-style pen simply had to promise to help the next neighbor do the same. This pay-it-forward engineering created a bond between the farmers that transcended the usual competition for land and equipment. As the years passed, Marcus Henderson became a fixture of the local landscape, though he never sought the spotlight. He could be seen most mornings on his ridge, checking the moisture levels in the vault or simply watching the way the sunlight hit the white oak slats. He had grown older, his hair the color of the silvered wood of his first structure, but he walked with a lightness that Silas Miller often envied. While other men his age were limited by the physical toll of decades of manual labor, Marcus was agile and healthy. His lazy man's errand had preserved his body as well as his land. The historical significance of the Henderson chiquero began to draw visitors from across the country. Professors from agricultural universities and engineers from the Department of Agriculture came to the Tennessee Valley to see the gravity farm. They took soil samples and measured flow rates, writing papers on sloped architecture, nutrient management, and anaerobic bypass systems. They used complex words to describe what Marcus had seen in a simple cedar stake and a transit level. Marcus would listen to them talk, a small smile playing on his lips, and then he would lead them to the vault and let them feel the heat of the compost. He knew that the math was important, but the feeling of the earth transforming itself was the true lesson. He could have built a monument to himself. He could have used his success to buy up the neighboring farms when the old-timers retired. He could have turned his innovation into a corporate franchise, but he didn't. Instead, he stayed on his ridge, tending his 20 hogs and his kitchen garden. He remained a man of the soil, a man who understood that the greatest innovation is the one that makes itself obsolete by becoming common sense. The profound lesson of Marcus Henderson's life was not about pigs or manure or even about gravity. It was about the courage to be laughed at. It was about the willingness to look at a steep, useless hillside and see a partner instead of a problem. Innovation is often born of a refusal to accept that the way we've always done it is the only way it can be done. It requires a specific kind of perseverance, the kind that doesn't just work hard, but works smart. It requires a man to stand his ground when the neighbors are whispering, to keep digging when the mud is thick, and to trust in the laws of physics when everyone else is trusting in the strength of their own backs. Marcus Henderson had shown the valley that the earth is not a flat, static thing to be scraped and beaten. It is a living, moving, three-dimensional engine of potential. He had shown them that the waste of yesterday is the wealth of tomorrow, provided you have the vision to let it fall into the right place. He had proven that a man who understands the slope of the land will never find himself at the bottom of it. As the sun sets over the Tennessee Valley today, the light catches the angles of dozens of hillside structures. They are built of different materials, some of steel, some of concrete, some of weathered oak, but they all follow the same invisible lines that Marcus Henderson traced in the red clay years ago. The creek runs clear, the pastures are a deep, vibrant green, and the sound of the valley is no longer the sound of shovels scraping concrete. It is the sound of the wind through the pines, the rush of water through well-aimed pipes, and the quiet, steady hum of the earth doing the work it was always meant to do. Marcus had realized his dream of a clean script for his life. He had removed the unnecessary scenes of struggle and replaced them with a narrative of efficiency and grace. He had reached the end of his career not with a broken back, but with a legacy that would feed the valley for 100 years. He had proven that if you give the earth a chance to help you, it will do so with a generosity that no machine can match. And as he sat on his porch, looking at the ridge that had once been his greatest critic and was now his greatest ally, Marcus Henderson knew that he had done more than just build a pig pen. He had built a bridge between the wisdom of the past and the necessity of the future, a bridge made of gravity, heat, and the unshakable belief that there is always a better way. The long-term impact of the Henderson system was eventually codified into a regional agricultural handbook, but the most important record of his work wasn't in a book. It was in the hands of the young men like Caleb Miller, who no longer feared the labor of the farm. It was in the health of the brook trout in the creek. It was in the taste of the tomatoes grown in the premium adubo. It was a reminder that we are all builders on a slope, and the secret to a good life is knowing how to use the incline to move forward. Marcus Henderson's story remains a testament to the power of the unconventional mind, a reminder that the people who change the world are often the ones who start by building a chiquero in a place where everyone else said it couldn't be done. The structural integrity of the hillside chiquero was not merely a matter of concrete and wood. It was a matter of soil mechanics and the deep, silent pressures of the Appalachian foothills. Marcus knew that the red clay of Tennessee was a living thing, expanding when saturated and shrinking into hard, cracked plates during the summer droughts. To build a permanent structure on such a shifting foundation required more than just standard footings. He spent 2 weeks hand-drilling 18 holes into the limestone shelf that sat for feet beneath the topsoil. He used a heavy-duty pneumatic drill, the vibration rattling his teeth and shoulders for 8 hours a day to set high-tensile steel anchors directly into the bedrock. These weren't just bolts, they were the roots of the machine. He poured a specialized high-sulfate-resistant concrete mix into these shafts, creating a series of subterranean pillars that would hold the entire structure against the lateral force of the mountain. The neighbors, seeing him wrestling with the heavy drill and the bags of specialized cement, gathered at the fence line like spectators at a strange, slow-motion sporting event. They didn't see the engineering, they saw a man fighting a hill. Silas Miller's cousin, a man named Jed who had spent 40 years building standard barns across the valley, told Marcus that he was over-engineering a problem that didn't exist. He said that a pig didn't care about the bedrock and that the hill would eventually win because the hill had more time than Marcus did. Marcus simply wiped the gray dust from his goggles and kept drilling. He knew that the difference between a legacy and a ruin was the depth of the foundation. He could have used standard pressure-treated posts driven into the dirt. He could have saved 2 weeks of back-breaking labor and $1,000 in materials, but he didn't. He wanted a structure that would still be standing when Silas Miller's grandchildren were deciding what to do with their lives. When the foundation was set, Marcus turned his attention to the precise geometry of the waste separation level. This was the intellectual heart of the innovation. Most people think of pig manure as a single, messy substance, but Marcus understood it as a complex mixture of liquids and solids with different physical properties. He designed the separation floor with a dual slope system. The primary slope was the 15-degree incline that moved the solids downward toward the composting vault. But he added a secondary, subtle V-shape to the concrete floor, a 3-degree pitch toward a central gutter. This ensured that the liquid nitrogen, the urine, and the wash water would move toward the center and into the filtration pipes immediately, while the heavier solids remained on the outer tracks of the epoxy. This prevented the solids from becoming a slurry, which is the primary cause of the anaerobic rotten egg smell on traditional farms. He spent for days with a fine-grit sander, polishing the epoxy coating on that separation level. He wanted it so smooth that a single drop of water would travel its entire length without stopping. The men at the feed store heard about this and laughed until they were red in the face. They called him the pig floor polisher. They couldn't fathom why a man would spend his time making a surface for manure as smooth as a dining room table. They didn't understand the physics of friction. Marcus knew that every microfissure in the concrete was a place where bacteria could hide and where waste could snag. By removing the friction, he was removing the labor. He was creating a self-cleaning surface that used the pig's own movement and the occasional misting to maintain a state of perfect hygiene. The upper living quarters were a masterclass in animal psychology. Marcus had observed that hogs are naturally clean animals if given the space and the right environment. They tend to dung in one area and sleep in another. He designed the white oak slats to be slightly narrower in the toilet area of the pen, encouraging the waste to pass through quickly, while the sleeping area featured wider, solid planks covered in a deep bedding of cedar shavings. The cedar wasn't just for comfort, it acted as a natural insect repellent and provided a pleasant aroma that countered the earthy smell of the hogs. He installed a gravity-fed, watering system that used a series of nipple drinkers, ensuring that the pigs always had fresh, clean water without the mess of a traditional trough that could be tipped over or foul. Every Saturday, the skepticism of the community seemed to reach a new peak. At the local diner, the Henderson Hill was the primary topic of conversation over coffee and biscuits. They talked about the cost of the white oak, which Marcus had sourced from an old tobacco barn he dismantled by hand. They talked about the complexity of the piping and the audacity of a man who thought he knew more than the generations of farmers who had come before him. A local official from the building department even stopped by, prompted by a concerned neighbor, to see if the structure met code. Marcus showed him the blueprints, the load-bearing calculations, and the environmental impact study he had conducted himself. The official left without a single citation, scratching his head at the level of detail Marcus had applied to a mere pig pen. As the build moved into its 4th month, the physical toll on Marcus was evident. He had lost 15 pounds, his hands were a map of scars and calluses, and his eyes were tired from the late nights spent calculating the chemical balances of the compost. But the structure was beautiful. It followed the curve of the ridge, its tiers rising like a staircase for giants. The white oak was framed with heavy timber joinery mortise and tenon joints secured with locust pegs. Marcus could have used galvanized nails and plywood. He could have slapped the building together in a weekend. But he didn't. He wanted a structure that breathed with the mountain, a building that would age with grace rather than rot with neglect. The first batch of hogs he introduced were more than just livestock. They were the test pilots for a new way of farming. He chose Durex for their hardiness and their ability to handle the changing Tennessee weather. When they first stepped onto the sloped floor, there was a moment of tension. Marcus watched from the bottom of the ridge, his heart hammering against his ribs. If the pigs were uncomfortable, if they couldn't find their footing, or if they panicked, the entire project would be a failure. But within 20 minutes, the pigs had adapted. They explored the levels, tested the drinkers, and eventually settled into the sleeping area. The innovation was no longer a theory, it was a living, breathing reality. The true validation came not from the pigs, but from the microbiology. Marcus began to study the adubo premium with a fervor that bordered on obsession. He bought a high-powered microscope and set up a small lab in a corner of his barn. He wanted to see the life that was creating the fertilizer. He documented the transition from raw waste to stable humus. He saw the fungal hyphae weaving through the carbon, the protozoa and beneficial bacteria that were turning nitrogen into a form that plants could actually use. He realized that the work of the farm was being done by billions of microscopic laborers that most farmers ignored or killed with chemicals. He started a demonstration plot near the road where the neighbors couldn't help but see it. He divided a 10-acre field into 3 sections. In the first, he used standard chemical fertilizer from the co-op. In the second, he used Romaner hulled from a traditional neighbor's farm. In the third, he used the composted black gold from his hillside vault. By mid-June, the difference was undeniable. The black gold section was twice as tall as the others. The stalks of the corn were thick and dark, the leaves wide and healthy. But more importantly, when a brief midsummer dry spell hit, the black gold section didn't wilt. The high organic matter in the compost had turned the soil into a sponge, holding onto every drop of moisture, while the other two sections began to brown and curl. The local community began to see the economic reality of the innovation. While Silas Miller was spending $5,000 a year on chemical fertilizers and another $3,000 on diesel for his manure spreader, Marcus Henderson's input costs were essentially zero. He was producing more fertilizer than he could use on his own land. He began to sell the excess in small bags to local gardeners. They called it Henderson's Miracle Mud when they saw their roses blooming 3 times in a season and their tomatoes reaching the size of soft balls. They stopped laughing. The mockery turned into a quiet, simmering curiosity. Marcus's philosophy on the sharing of the hill was tested when a large industrial farming corporation sent a representative to his door. The man wore a suit and carried a briefcase, and he offered Marcus a significant sum of money for the exclusive rights to the design. He wanted to turn the hillside chiquero into a standardized, patented product for large-scale CAFO's concentrated animal feeding operations. Marcus listened to the pitch, looking at the man's polished shoes and then at the lush, green ridge. He realized that the corporation didn't want to help the small farmer, they wanted to control the innovation. He could have been a wealthy man. He could have walked away from the labor of the farm forever, but he didn't. He told the representative that the design belonged to the mountain and that any man with a shovel and the will to work was welcome to copy it for free. This act of defiance solidified his place in the community. He wasn't just a crazy innovator anymore. He was a guardian of the local farming culture. He began to host Hillside Sundays, where neighbors would come to his farm to learn about composting, soil health, and the principles of gravity-fed systems. He taught them how to read the land, how to see the potential in the ravines and the ridges that they had previously considered waste ground. He showed them that the key to survival in the modern era wasn't more machinery, but more understanding. The legacy of Marcus Henderson grew as the climate began to show signs of increasing volatility. As the 100-year storms began to happen every decade and the droughts became longer and more intense, the farms that had adopted the Henderson standard were the only ones that remained profitable. The hillside chiqueros became a symbol of resilience. They were a physical manifestation of a truth that the valley had forgotten, that wealth isn't what you take from the land, but what you leave behind. In the final years of his life, Marcus spent much of his time sitting on a bench at the base of his original structure. He watched the third generation of pigs move across the white oak slats. He watched the clear water from the bioswale trickle into the creek. He saw the descendants of Silas Miller building their own terraces on the far side of the valley. He knew that the innovation would continue to evolve. Others would add solar-powered misting systems, or use the methane from the vaults to heat their homes, or find even better carbon sources for the compost, and that was exactly what he wanted.